I'm using the microphone because the acoustics in here are not quite right, and I didn't want people to join us and try to watch a video that they couldn't hear and understand. So I'm trying to appease both worlds here. Continuing with the book of Luke, remember a couple weeks ago we started this online study. What you've got tonight is the next section of the study of Luke. So just recapping a little bit, Luke, the book of Luke was written by Luke, who was a companion of Paul. A lot of folks think that all of the disciples or all of the authors of the New Testament were disciples of Jesus and were followers and knew Jesus closely. Luke was not one of those. He actually came along after the fact. He knew Paul and Peter and some of the other followers of Jesus, but was not one of the disciples, and was not one of the ones that was there to get a first-hand, up-close and personal story. So when we read Luke's Gospels, it's interesting to see how much Luke knew, but it's based on the account of others that he was close to. So the book of Luke was written in AD 60. And we remember that all of the books of the New Testament, Jesus died about AD 33, roughly. And all of the books of the New Testament were written by 100 AD when John died. John was the only one of the authors of the New Testament who lived to old age and died of natural causes. All of the others were martyred and died at early ages. So John was the only one. He died around 100 AD. So all that we find in the New Testament was written in that 70-ish year period between the death of Jesus and 100 AD. So Luke's story, we might see, some folks have said that Luke is actually a letter. It was written to Theophilus. And some have said that it could be called the Gospel of Paul, because his theologies align with the teachings of Paul so strongly. We also know that Luke also wrote not only the book of Luke, but also the book of Acts. And Acts, in essence, is a continuation of the book of Luke. So some folks have said, well, you could say the gospel, like Luke 1 is the gospel, and Acts could be Luke 2. If you fell in line with 1st and 2nd Timothy, 1st, 2nd Peter, then that would be the consideration with Luke being the author of 2 books here. So we discussed some of the different components and the attributes of the book of Luke that caused it to be a unique book. Some of the parables that Luke is the only one to speak about. And then when we ended last week, we were at the place of beginning to talk about how the critics respond to the book of Luke. And that's where we pick up tonight. One of the pieces that we've been doing in the book of Matthew and Mark prior was, after we got through the basics of what the book looks like, then we started talking about how do critics respond to it. What are the issues that they have when they look at the book with a critical viewpoint? And it has caused a lot of people's eyes to be opened some, and people to say, that makes sense now. There have been questions that have been answered that people had for a long time and didn't know what the answer was. So we've been able to cover some of those things. So a few of those is what we have tonight. The first one, Luke chapter 1, verse 26 through 33, is the first spot where we see a critic pinpoint an issue. This also coincides with Matthew chapter 1, verse number 20. The question here is, was the announcement of the birth of Christ made to Mary or to Joseph? Does anybody know the answer? Without looking at the paper? Right. What about Joseph? Was it made to... Is it an either or?
Yeah. They both.
I'm sure they got both of them.
I mean, the Holy Spirit was there, and the angel.
Right. Well, here's the problem that they see. Matthew tells the birth announcement was made to Joseph, and that's the only mention that Matthew makes. Luke, however, tells the story of the announcement being made to Mary. So, from a critic's viewpoint, who's right? Who's telling the whole story here? Well, remember that each one of the books are written from a different viewpoint to a different group of people, to a different audience. So they're telling different parts of the story. The solution is that Mary was told first. Mary was the one that was going to have the baby, right? So Mary was told first, visited by the angel, and then in order for Luke to continue, for Joseph to be able to be okay with the situation that was about to affect his life, because she was espoused to him, this was his future bride, and this baby was not his. The only way to explain that was for an angel to come down and tell him that, right? Because humankind would say, well, now wait a minute, this is not right? And would have put her away or done something probably not as nice to her, would have shunned her and her family. But instead, we know the story that Joseph understood the angel's viewpoint and what the angel had to say, so he stuck around and made things happen the way that they did. So this kind of pairing, where we see two different viewpoints or two different visions, two different stories, is also seen in Acts chapter 10 with Cornelius and Peter, and also in Acts chapter 9 with Saul and Ananias, where they were telling two different parts of the story or two different sides of the story. All right, so Luke chapter 2, verse number 1 is our next one. And again, these are points that critics would look at and say, there's an issue, there's a problem. They always look for the mistake. So here are the issues that they find. Did Luke make a mistake when he mentioned a worldwide census under Caesar Augustus? Here's the problem. Luke tells of a worldwide census under Caesar Augustus when Quirinius was governor of Syria. According to the annals of ancient history, no such census ever took place. Now, understand, when we're talking about worldwide at that point, what was worldwide at that point? It was right there in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was the world to the Romans. That's all that they were concerned with, was right there where they controlled. So a worldwide census, as we know it today, would be the entire world, every country. But at that time, it was probably the picture of those in the Roman Empire. So how do we find the solution? Traditionally, it was thought that Luke really did make a mistake, because history would have recorded something so large, right? That was the tradition. We get in trouble sometimes with our traditions. However, further study and more recent scholarship have changed that trend of thought that said that Luke made a mistake by finding that there was more to the story. Number one, people were compelled and encouraged and made to, really, in the Roman Empire, to take an oath of allegiance to the emperor and to the empire. So in taking such an oath of allegiance, they would express their allegiance to everything within the Roman Empire. This kind of count, then, would not be uncommon for the emperor to put in place to know how many people were in his empire who were pledging allegiance. It would also come into play for them to be able to know what men were eligible for military service. A third reason for doing this is to prepare for the collection of taxes. So if you're going to tax the people, you need to know how much money you're about to collect, right? You need to know how many people there are that you're going to be serving taxes on. So another thing is that periodically, the periodic registrations of this kind took place every 14 years. So while it may have been said to be a worldwide census, a worldwide count, it may have just been there within the Roman Empire, and it fell within every 14 years. A census also was a massive project. It is believed to have taken up to 40 years to complete a census. So if you think of a count being done in an area every 14 years, then it's not completed in the entire area, the entire region, for up to 40 years. They're counting people constantly. It was not an unusual requirement that people return to the place of their origin or the place where they owned property. So the place where they came from, the place where they were born, is where they would be counted. Kind of like today, when we do a census, it's based on your address of where you live, right? In that case, it would have been you go back to where you were born to be counted with your people, your kind, and all of the families would come together for such an undertaking like that. So what is the truth of the matter here is that a count was done, even though it may not have been worldwide the way we read into it. But remember, when we're looking at the New Testament and the Old Testament as well, we have to understand what's being said in the book by the author with their intended purpose and intention behind it. It's easy for us to look at the Bible and read and say, oh, I understand what that means, applying our current knowledge backward and trying to make something out of it that's not really there. Does that make sense? So when we look at people being counted for taxes and things, we apply that to what we know in the United States, when things would have been a lot different in that time and in that region. Another thing that we have to understand is what the writer's intended purpose was when they were writing. So Luke, remember, was writing to Greek believers and people that were young Greek converts, establishing why Jesus was the perfect man. He portrayed him to be the Son of Man, right? So when when Luke was trying to tell them why Jesus was the perfect man, he had to put it in language that they would understand. And this was one of the things they would understand, was being counted worldwide, was within what they believed to be their world, the Roman Empire. Okay? So, the third critical point here is Luke chapter 2, verse number 2. The question is, when Quirinius was not governor until AD 6. Now, if we remember that Jesus was born, you might remember roughly when he was born? Around AD 99. Right around there, 97, 98, 99, somewhere along in there, and then died around, BC, and then died right around 30 to 33. I'm getting my numbers mixed up. Looking at it backwards, trying to get my numbers mixed up. So how does that fit if they were going, when Mary was pregnant with Jesus, and they were going to be counted, how does that fit if Quirinius really was not governor yet until 6 AD? Luke says that, here's the problem. Luke says that the census decreed by Augustus was the first one taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. I believe the King James says when he was first governor of Syria. Quirinius did not become governor until the death of Herod, which was about AD 6. Is this an error? Well, the solution is that Luke did not make an error. We have to understand as well that when we're looking at the Bible, it was written in another language, and it's been translated. And sometimes the translation is not always perfect. So there's some human error there in translation. Quirinius Varus Quintilius Varus was governor of Syria from about 7 BC to 4 BC. Varus was not a trustworthy leader. Matter of fact, he was an absolutely horrible leader. And he proved that later, after he was not in office anymore, and he was back into military leadership, when he was in Germany, in the Teutoburg forest, and lost 3 entire legions of soldiers. Now, I don't know how you lose that many soldiers, but apparently he was a terrible leader. So he was not trustworthy. So it may have been that Quirinius, being a noted military leader who was trustworthy, was assigned the task of the governor's role during the census time. It's also been suggested that Quirinius was governor actually twice. It may have been one time or the other. And then the third thing is that the translation. The word translated there could have been translated also as before, saying that this census took place before Quirinius was governor. And if that was the case, then everything fits and lines up perfectly with any of those situations. All right, so the fourth thing that we have to look at is Luke chapter 3, verses number 23 through 38. This is one that is noticeable if you look at genealogy. When we've talked about genealogy and names before, we've studied some of the names of the Old Testament. It's very easy for us when we get to those places in the Bible where it starts listing names, and so-and-so begat so-and-so, and they begat so-and-so, it goes on and on. It's easy for us to skip that whole block and say, I can't pronounce those names anyway, and I don't care. Is it really important? Honestly, it is important, because it gives us the background of where someone came from. Now, when we're looking at Old Testament names, if we're looking at those passages, and some of you have been in the classes where I've taught this, if you look at the meaning behind the Hebrew name for each of those people listed in the Old Testament, you find a hidden prophetic message. So when you look them up, those names go together like pieces to a puzzle. And you get messages from Adam all the way to Jesus. That's pretty neat to look at. We've done some of that in the past. So why does Luke present a different ancestral tree for Jesus than the one mentioned in Matthew? One of our issues is that we tend to look at the Bible in the structure and in the order that it's in the way we have it today. And we automatically think we're reading from beginning to end. Right? When in essence, have you ever watched a movie where you get the ending scene at the beginning, and then they go back and tell you the story of how you got there? And then, so the movie really begins and ends at the same place? That's kind of the way the Bible can be written. If you look at the book of Revelation, you can see that as the ending point. And then you go back to Genesis and begin reading, and it tells you how we got there. Right? So you can see it in that kind of viewpoint. The other thing is understanding that the Bible is in order because men sat down and said, we like this order, not because it's in chronological order. So when we studied the Old Testament, some folks were shocked to find out that all of the history of the Old Testament was found between Genesis and Nehemiah. Everything after the book of Nehemiah fit within that period. All of those prophets were from during that period of time. Job actually was written by Moses, and that was a shocker for some, about a man who lived before the time of Moses. He was telling the story of Job. So when we look at all of those pieces, and then we come to the New Testament and look, we figure out that things are not necessarily in chronological order. So when we look at Matthew, we see Matthew as the authority because he's the first book. But that's not necessarily the case. Not even necessarily the first book written in the New Testament, but just the order that they decided to put the books of the Bible in. Right? Okay. So the problem is, Jesus had a different grandfather in Luke chapter 3, verse 23. His grandfather is listed as Heli. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 16, his grandfather is listed as Jacob. So how does he end up with two different grandfathers? Confusing, right? Somebody made a mistake. Well, no, not necessarily. Again, remember that Matthew was telling the story from the viewpoint of a establishing to Jewish believers that Jesus was the Messiah. So to focus on Jesus being the Messiah, Matthew's going to tell his ancestry from the viewpoint of getting to the Messiah and why he is the Messiah, right? When Luke comes along, Luke is talking to a broader audience of Greek believers. And he's trying to establish Jesus as the Son of Man. And give them the reason, in their viewpoint, which is their quest of thought, is that Jesus was the perfect man. Greeks were really big on somebody being perfect, right? So we see two separate lines of ancestry presented, one through his legal father, which was Joseph, and the other through his actual mother, which was Mary. So Matthew gives the official line, establishing the Messiah, where Luke gives the other side there, establishing the Son of Man. So I put in there the chart that gives you the genealogies comparing them. That Matthew tells he looks at David and comes through Solomon. Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jacob, then Joseph, Mary, and then Jesus. Where Luke goes David to Nathan, Mattathiah, Menon, Meliah, Eliakim, Heli, Joseph, Mary, and then Jesus. So they're telling two different viewpoints to establish Jesus as different figures, the same man, but different figures to fit the audience that they were writing to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you kind of think...
People argued in the church about it too.
People have, yes.
Even Paul had to correct people.
Yes.
Bickering over genealogies and stuff.
Yes. It's establishing the case of where did Jesus really come from. When you had critics and people looking to discredit as well. So, depending on the different audience, they're taking a different viewpoint. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we've seen that be the case. They're all writing for different purposes to different people. So it's not so much, some people will just kind of brush it off as, well, they were just telling parts of the story from their viewpoint, when really they're telling the parts of the story that pertain to the audience they're writing to, right? So if you think about Luke not even being a first-hand relationship of Jesus and getting the story from Paul and Peter and some of the other disciples after Jesus was gone, then Luke is telling a pretty comprehensive story based on all the stories that he got. Can you imagine sitting around the campfire with those guys? If Luke got that much just from sitting by, and he tells us, if you remember, if you watched the video from last week, I think it was, Luke is the one who takes us from pre-birth of John the Baptist all the way beyond the ascension. And then, of course, in the book of Acts takes us on further to what happened after the day of Pentecost, and then the upcoming, for the following weeks and months after that, as the kingdom and the church began to spread. So, looking at it from their viewpoints, you get a different picture when you begin to understand why they were writing what they were writing. Does that make sense? Some of you look like I'm losing. You okay?
Yeah.
All right, we're almost done. The last one, I decided to stop here tonight because I like this one. Luke chapter 4, verses 3 through 12. I've always been fascinated by the story of Jesus going into the wilderness to prepare for his ministry, fasting for 40 days and nights, and Satan being stupid enough to think that he could tempt the Son of God. And he knew who Jesus was, right? He knew who Jesus was. There's absolutely no reason of clear thought that he should have been able to even approach Jesus in that manner, but yet he thought he was big enough to do it, right? Which is what got him in trouble to start with, right? That's what got him kicked out of heaven. He thought he was big enough to be equal to God. So he takes Jesus and he begins to offer temptations to him, only to find that Jesus will not bow, of course. We're not surprised, but Satan probably was. So the question here, also looking at Matthew chapter 4, verses 3 through 10, is there a mistake in recording the wilderness temptation of Christ by Matthew or Luke? The problem is, according to both authors, the first temptation was to turn stones into bread. So they're both in agreement there. Now, that's a play on the fact that Jesus had just fasted 40 days and nights. He's going to be hungry. So both of them hit that point together, because the first temptation he was going to take was taking... What? You're fine. The first temptation was to play on the fact that Jesus was hungry because he'd been fasting for 40 days and nights. So the first temptation then, obviously, is to turn stones into bread. That plays on the human nature, the hunger, knowing that his stomach would growl by the smell of fresh bread, right? Anybody else ever been there? You get hungry and the smell of fresh bread just, starving to death. Matthew lists the second temptation to take place at the pinnacle of the temple. And then the third temptation, listed by Matthew, involved all the kingdoms of the world. Now, I don't know why Satan thought that he could tempt Jesus with all the kingdoms of the world when Jesus is the Son of God who owns everything to start with.
Well, Jesus has never been in the flesh before, and Satan knows it.
Exactly.
And so he figures, well, I can take anybody in the flesh because he's done it for centuries.
Right.
But so he figures, well, Jesus is just going to roll over because he's in the flesh like all the men.
So he's playing on his humanity.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely. Trying to find the weak point. And now that he's come out of 40 days in the wilderness fasting, offering him these worldly things at a weak point in life, well, he might just take it, right? That was Satan's line of thought. Luke mentions the same two events, but he reverses the order. So which is correct? Well, my first response is, well, does it really matter? He was tempted 3 times. Does it really matter? And it's been that way on a lot of these points. Why does that even matter to someone? But it may be that Matthew describes them chronologically, while Luke lists them topically or climatically. In other words, Matthew is saying this is what happened in order, being very methodical, and again reminding you that he is writing to the Jews. Luke now is dealing with the Greeks, and it may have been more of building suspense. Maybe this is building the story to keep them involved, right? So that he is changing the order for that reason. Now the other thing, and I brought the book in here mainly for this purpose, to help me with this one. See where I'm at here. Okay, here we go. It may be to express the climax he desired to emphasize. Matthew 4 and 5 begins with the word then, while verse 8 begins with the word again. In Greek, these words suggest a more sequential order of the events. In Luke's account, however, verses 5 and 9 both begin with a simple and, signifying that the order didn't really matter. He's just telling the story that he was tempted. The Greek, in the case of Luke's account, does not necessarily indicate a sequential order of events. Furthermore, there is no reason to doubt that all of these temptations actually happen. Understand that when we're looking at what a critic picks at, they look for anything. And their goal and their viewpoint is to discredit anything that the Bible says. So when they're looking at it, they're nitpicking, basically, trying to find those little windows of opportunity to say, somebody made a mistake. Have you ever heard those people that say, oh, well, there's so many mistakes in the Bible. There's so many mistakes that do we really understand what it really says? I've heard that over and over. And then you hear the arguments of which translation has the least amount of mistakes, which one's most, have you ever looked to see which one's most accurate? The King James is not the most accurate translation. It's the most beautiful in the language. If you've ever looked at a reading level chart with Bible translations listed, King James is about a college level reading because it was written during the Shakespearean period. So if you love Shakespeare, you would probably love the King James Version of the Bible. If you're less inclined to Shakespeare, like me, need something a little more simple, there are other translations that give you a simple, more forward translation.
You get a better understanding sometimes looking at a different version.
Right.
On the King James, yeah, because of the Shakespearean English.
Yes.
Maybe you say, oh, what is it? Check it to another version, you're like, okay, that's what
If you look at what translations are supposed to be the most accurate, the English Standard Version is the number one. That's the one I was using Sunday. The number two is the American Standard, which is right there. I mean, it's right there. King James is in the top 5 or so translations, but you know there are still a lot of words that were translated 400 years ago that did not exist in English that matched the Greek or Hebrew. So then you run into those folks that say, you've heard me say this before, you run into those folks that say, well, I only read the King James 1611. And I have to pull out, and I'll Google the King James 1611 and show them what it actually looks like. And they say, I can't read that. Because it is in Old English from 1611. So it's been updated multiple times. When I'm using the King James Version on the PowerPoints on Sundays, when that comes up, if you ever notice, at the bottom of the page, it says King James Version 1905, I think. So it's somewhere around that. It's over 100-year-old version of the King James there. So it's been updated to keep the language fresh as it's been continued to be published around the world ever since the 1600s, right? So an understanding, and I hope you get something out of this, that there seem to be several people that really enjoy looking at these critical points because it gives us some understanding a little deeper than just reading the verse and saying, oh, well, and you're connecting dots here too to see where we line up. Because the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are similar, but they're not exactly the same. And Luke is the one that is the most diverse, the most unique, in that he gives more parables and stories than some of the others. There's some that only Luke tells. And it's probably from his viewpoint, his vantage point of being around Peter and Paul and the other disciples and hearing all of their stories, because maybe this one was with Jesus when that happened, and this one was with Jesus when that happened. So Luke kind of gets the best of both worlds here. He hears all of the stories, even though he did not know Jesus personally, was not personally acquainted with him. It's fascinating to me. He's a good storyteller, right? So that's where we'll leave off for tonight. There is enough for one more week of covering the critical points before we move on to the book of John. Do you have any questions or comments before we close tonight?
I just know, me personally, the critics' points on these, you know, I never really even noticed them anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't jump out to me like that because, in my mind, from reading the Bible, it just all makes sense anyway. So, but I know they're in there.
Yeah.
So thanks for pointing them out.
Well, it also helps us when people are coming to you and saying, oh, there's so many mistakes in the Bible. And then you can say, Matthew wrote to
Yes.
certain people, and so did Luke, and,
Right.
you know, they had their audiences. And I did say that to someone last week, and they were like, oh, I never thought of that before, you know? So it
Right.
gives them a chance to think about not mistakes. Maybe this was a broader subject, so.
It's a different viewpoint, depending on the audience. If I were telling a story from my life to Sister Carmen, I would probably tell the things that she would understand, right? So if I'm telling about the hardship of childhood with not having the running water and, you know, using a wood stove and those things, I would probably tell her, in the house that I, you know, as a small child, I was 5 or 6 years old, 5 years old, I think, when we got our bathroom and running water, but we used a chamber pot. And she would probably understand what that is,
Right.
whereas if I'm talking to Katie,
Yes.
at 25, she's going to say, what?
A bucket.
And so she's not going to understand exactly what I'm talking about. So I may change my story to fit the audience that I'm telling it to. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And that's kind of where we are, even in the books of the Bible. We see who they're writing to, and it makes a big difference when we begin to understand it. I was fascinated to find out that the book of Philippians, I think it is, was written, Philippians, was written to the Philippian church. But much of that book is dealing with the fact that there was a fight among the women in the church. And it's how to discipline the women who were fighting in the church. So it's fascinating to know why they were written and who they were written to and what the purpose was behind it, right? So, so when we look at it, there is a distinct purpose and reason behind why it's written the way it is and why it's put together the way it is. Any other comments, questions? All right, well, let's stand tonight. We're going to close in prayer. We want to pray for Brother Sims tonight. Pray for the Gooden family, my stepdad and his brother, family. Pray for Carmen. She's not feeling too good right now. And then pray for each other, right? Let's pray together. Father, we thank you tonight, Lord,